Jimbo Fisher is heading into his sixth season at Texas A&M, and with significant roster attrition as the key focus in College Station, our Sam Khan Jr. is here to help us sort out the state of the Aggies roster. Sam, you wrote a great piece on The Athletic analyzing the roster. We're going to dive into some of your biggest takeaways. First of all, what stood out when assessing where the A&M roster is?
Well, the reason I wanted to do this was there was a lot written and discussed about how many guys left the program in the winter transfer portal window. They lost 25 scholarship guys. That they only ended up adding three total coming into the program, one of which is already gone. So I was curious, where are they scholarship wise compared to the 85? You're always going to be a little bit under in spring ball because you don't have all your freshman recruits that are coming in. Some of those guys come in the summer, but I was just curious, where are they? And I think the thing that stood out to me the most was that they are at 66 scholarships by my count in spring ball. And when you add their incoming freshmen who haven't arrived yet, that weren't mid-year enrollees, they'll be at 75. And so that's 10 short of the 85 that you need to be at the maximum scholarship limit. And that means that they're going to have to hit the portal really heavily in this spring window that's coming up here really soon. And that's something that Jimbo Fisher just hasn't done in his. This is his sixth year now at Texas A&M. They've only taken in 7 scholarship transfers combined in those 6 recruiting cycles. So to think that they're going to have to go in and get double digit guys, and that's even if they don't lose anybody to the portal after spring football, which everybody pretty much does once you set depth charts. It just brought to me a fascinating window into where A&M stands as a roster and how different they're going to have to manage it to get back to the 85 heading into the 2023 season.
Well, we know transfers are a huge part of college football now, so we expect annual exits from players, but Texas A&M has seen a shocking number of players leaving the program.
Right. Yeah. Like I mentioned, the 25 scholarship guys that left after last season, a lot of those guys, for the most part, were either depth guys who were second teamers. There were some guys that were rotational. They definitely lost, I think, 7 guys from that 2022 recruiting class that ranked number one all time. So there's definitely some significant attrition. But I think what stood out the most to me was how much attrition happened in his first few classes at A&M. In they had 77 signees in the 2018, 2019, and 2020 classes combined, and 51 of those did not finish out at A&M for various reasons. Some of them transferred, some of them medically retired, some of them just otherwise just didn't end up finish playing football there. So that's what really stood out to me, because we talk about the high level that A&M recruits at, and Jimbo Fisher has signed 4 straight top 8 recruiting classes from 2019 to 2022. But when you're losing players at that rate, then it kind of gives you a little bit of a different picture of how good are you really recruiting. They just really haven't been able to retain as many players. And everybody, like you said, everybody loses guys. But it's, can you retain the good ones, develop them? 2019 is a really good example because you have some really good guys in 2019, like Kenyon Green, who went on to be a draft pick, DeMarvin Leal, who went on to be a draft pick, Isaiah Spiller also went on to become a draft pick. Damani Richardson was in that class, but 10 of the top 14 rated recruits in that 2019 class, even though it was a good class in terms of star power, 10 of the top 14 in that class ended up going to finish their career elsewhere. So that's I think that's the reason why A&M is kind of in this position from a roster standpoint, is they just have had a lot of turnover and a lot of attrition from some of those earlier recruiting classes.
Well, one of the most important parts of building long-term success is roster depth. And you note that A&M needs to get back to or somewhat near the 85 man scholarship limit. What advantages do you see getting closer near to that limit will help Jimbo Fisher and A&M?
It's just providing some depth. And I think what's most important for them, and why I think they need to hit the transfer portal window really hard in the spring, is getting some veteran players in, because they had to rely a lot on youth in 2022. They had an unbelievable amount of injuries throughout the year. They were really banged up on the offensive line. They had to play a really young defensive line because of their previous starting defensive line. All of them had graduated or gone on to the draft, and they really took it on the chin in 2022. They had some games where they were really low in terms of available scholarship players on the field, especially toward the end of the season. Of course, they went 5-7. They struggled on the field mightily. So I think in order to compete against the teams that they have to in the SEC West, Alabama, Auburn, LSU, those types of programs. And of course, if you're trying to contend for an SEC title, you got to go up against a Georgia from the East. You have to be able to be playing with a pretty similar deck in terms of depth that those teams do, because that's really what I think separates those great teams. Is not just It's not just that Alabama has a lot of 5 stars or Georgia has a lot of 5 stars. It's that when other guys come in, they got 5 stars or high 4 stars right behind them. And that's the thing, is when you're low on the scholarship numbers, like not everybody in the 85 is going to play, because you only travel when you go to a road game, you only travel with 70. But having as many and getting as close to that point is how you help develop that depth over time and help sustain your program long term.
Areas of need and biggest holes are always a huge talking point. Where do the Aggies need the most help?
Cornerback is really one of the biggest ones, and they were able to address that a little bit in the portal in the winter window. The 2 transfers that they got that ended up staying, Tony McGrimes and Sam McCall, will help there. Both of them have been practicing at corner in spring football. Grimes from North Carolina, McCall from Florida State. So that was important because they lost 7 cornerbacks in the winter. 6 of them went left for the portal. One of them they lost, Jalen Jones, to the NFL draft. So they could still use, I think, another 1 or 2 veteran corners to bring in. Linebackers, another spot. They lost Andre White, who's a veteran rotational guy. He started, I think, 11 games combined in the last 2 years. He's been a valuable guy for them. He was a guy who ended up going to Georgia Tech. To be able to replace him would be huge, because they just really don't have. They have some experience at the start at starting linebacker. They have Edgerrin Cooper and they have Chris Russell, but they really need some depth behind them, because really all they have behind them are really young guys, first or second year players. And the other place is at receiver. You wouldn't think that A&M needs many receivers, because they have a really great core. They've got Evan Stewart, who was a 5-star in the 2022 class. You got Moose Muhammad the third, broke out as a really talented guy, and Anaya Smith, who I think is their best all-around player on the team, announced that he was going to bypass the draft in February and that he's coming back. So having those guys is huge. But beyond them, again, kind of like at linebacker, a lot of youth, a lot of first and second year guys, and they really only have, I believe, 7 scholarship receivers on the roster at the moment. So I think that's another place where you could use another player or two. And that's where one of their transfers, they brought in Tyron Smith from UTEP. He came in and then kind of wavered on whether or not he wanted to stay. So it doesn't look like he's going to be on the roster this fall, but they could definitely use another receiver or two in the portal.
Well, we go from biggest needs to biggest strengths, and boy, are the Aggies deep up front on both sides of the ball.
Yeah, they are. They've done a really good job in offensive line and defensive line recruiting the last few years, particularly on the defensive line. You got to give Elijah Robinson and Terry Price, the defensive line coaches, a ton of credit. That you guys have seen some of the guys that they had a couple years ago. I mentioned DeMarvin Leal, but he's gone. They've got McKinley Jackson. They've got uh, Fadil Diggs. They've got LT Overton, Walter Nolan, who was the top defensive line recruit in the 2022 class, Shamar Stewart, LT Overton. They've got a ton of guys on the defensive line. Now they took their lumps there. Like I said, they were really young on that defensive line last year, and so that was a little bit of a challenge for them. But a lot of those guys are back. They're going to be able to rotate. They're going to be real deep up there, and then offensively, they bring all 5 starters back on the offensive line. I think that's huge for them. And so they're a little bit older on the offensive line. They're a little bit more veteran. And I think in spring ball, they're operating with about 16 scholarship offensive linemen. They got 1 more coming in the summer from the 2023 signing class. So I think they're in really good shape in the trenches. And if they can hold on and develop those players, I think that they can really build a strong foundation for this team, because if you're good in the trenches, particularly in the SEC, it gives you a shot to have some success.
And I mentioned it at the top. This will be Jimbo's 6th season at Texas A&M. And I guess the bottom line to this whole conversation is, how are the Aggies still this young into his tenure? Is this a bad reflection on him?
I think it's just a picture of how much the roster, I think, hasn't been managed optimally. Like, as I mentioned, the lack of transfer they bought, and I think if you look at it and could do it all over again, if you're Jimbo Fisher, because you're looking at a roster right now that you're going into next year with, most of it is going to be first and second year players, or the guys who are contributing at a high level. You're going to have some that are veteran guys that are seniors. They've got 10 seniors on the roster right now, and they're going to play major roles. I mentioned Anaya Smith. I mentioned Damani Richardson, Layden Robinson. Chris Russell, McKinley Jackson. These are all guys who are veteran guys who have been on this roster. But you're going to look at right now when the summer comes and you get those signees in, 41 of those 75 guys are going to be first year or second year players. And so the fact that you're in year six and that you're having this younger roster, sometimes it happens in circumstances. I get it, but I think this is where not being able to retain some of those players, at least a few more of them, and having so much attrition and not using the portal a little bit more than they have, I think is where it really leaves a gap and where now you're kind of scrambling going into the fall to fill out that roster and to get your team a little bit older because they do have a ton of talent. And that's the one thing I will give them credit for is that they have a ton of talent. They've recruited a lot of really high quality players. Connor Wegman, the quarterback, I think is going to be a star. I mentioned all those receivers. They got a 5-star running back they just signed, Reuben Owens. All that defensive line talent. They've got a nucleus of players from a pure talent standpoint that I think can get it done. But if you don't have the depth and you can't develop and retain the players on a consistent basis, it makes it hard to build a consistent winner, which ultimately is what Texas A&M hired Jimbo Fisher to do.
Well, it'll be very interesting to see how this roster structure fares in the SEC this season. Well, for more on Texas A&M, go follow and read our Techspert Sam Khan Jr. on The Athletic. Sam, thanks so much for your insight.
No problem. Thanks for having me.